Hey everybody, welcome to Q&A video number 62. Make sure you keep asking questions. Doesn't matter about. They can be about anything. Just know that I do not respond to review requests or Let's Play requests in these videos, but I will respond to those in the comments. Once again, those are what do you think about insert game here. I don't answer that stuff in Q&As. Those are review requests or MTL requests or whatever you want to call them. Now, if you ask me about a specific feature of a game or lack thereof, or about something in the news surrounding it, something like that, that's fine, but don't ask me about what I think about a game, because it's not going to get answered in this. Gameplay in the background is of Assassin's Creed Liberation HD, mostly because it relates kind of to the last question for this Q&A, but we will get to that in a moment. Let's first start with a question from Baba Snooker. What are your thoughts on the new Star Wars Battlefront not having a single-player campaign? I've heard that's because DICE and EA have found that not many people play the single-player campaigns in their games. I think it's a bit silly to use data on generic military shooters to make a decision about such a memorable movie franchise. Well, here's the thing. Campaign and Galactic Conquest and everything were a very big part of the first two Star Wars Battlefront games. I don't know about the other ones because I haven't played those. But with regards to DICE and EA games, mostly people just play their multiplayer. And it stands to reason. Their single-player abilities are pretty terrible. I mean, seriously, guys, have you not seen Battlefield 3 and 4? Their single-player campaigns were atrocious. So, if you were to expect them to actually be able to put together a competent campaign for Battlefront, then you're just straight up wrong. So, it's probably a good thing that they haven't put one in this one, but then you have the problem of, does the multiplayer compensate for that? And from what I played with the beta, it really doesn't. So the real thing is this. It comes down to what you're getting in the actual game box, for example. When you buy your $60 release, what does it have in it? Well, Battlefront is going to have exclusively multiplayer and co-op stuff outside of sort of being able to do single player in the survival mode. And let's face it, they are not aiming at the kind of crowd that is going to really care about a single-player campaign. The people who care about that stuff are the people who played the older Battlefront games, and they want more of that sort of thing, like myself, of course. And what we're getting instead is something that's aimed at the mass market that they want to sell just because it's Star Wars and they know they can get away with whatever the hell they can do. So what's basically happening there is they are cutting costs by not throwing in a single-player campaign, and really that's probably for the better just because DICE hasn't been able to make a single-player campaign worth really anything. So we'll have to ultimately see what happens with the full release, but it certainly devalues the full game, let's put it that way. As for figuring out big decisions about big franchises and such like that, really they're trying to play it safe, and they always have been trying to play it safe. So relying on the data is one of the things they do. Whether that's a good idea or not, well, that just depends on how good the game is on launch, doesn't it? Anyway, let's move on to a question from The Real Chim Shady. What are your thoughts on the staggered release of mostly Japanese games like Etrian Odyssey Untold 2? I have to wait until January while the US got it this summer. I think Japan got the game sometime in 2014. Well, first things first, it takes a lot of time to do translations. I know because I've done them. And while I haven't done them on something the scale of a video game, even for smaller projects, they take hours and hours and hours. So you're talking about a lot of work that has to be put into translating it for the local regions, whether that be translating it just to English for the US and UK releases, or translating it to, say, French or German or any number of other languages. And then once you've got it translated, then you're worrying about the actual certification process, because every single country has a different certification process. Then you got to worry about marketing and actually getting the physical copies in the various regions. It's a mess. And so when it comes to these whole staggered releases, it kind of makes sense for them to be staggered to some degree. Now, when it gets to some pretty ridiculous delays, like, say, what happened with the original Mother, where it didn't come out in the West until 20-some years after its release, which was just ridiculous, and especially considering we got Earthbound pretty quickly after it was released. But stuff like that is rather problematic, and I don't really know why it took them so long to get around to that. Mostly the excuse seems to be, well, there doesn't seem to be a market for it. There's always a market for it, so that's really not much of an excuse. But ultimately, things cost time and money, and if they don't feel like it's worth the investment of that time and money, they're not going to do it. Or they're just going to dawdle for a while and see if they can recoup some of the costs of developing the game in general in the home region. The thing is, as well, that Japan is kind of the anomaly when it comes to this. They make games for the Japanese market, and those games tend to have pretty niche markets everywhere else. So they don't really have as much incentive to really get the thing out as quickly as possible everywhere else. They know they're going to make most of their money in Japan to begin with, so they're going to just work on that, and then they can worry about the other regions later. And you see that mostly with things like JRPGs, with visual novels, stuff like that, that's very intrinsically Japanese, and thus would have a pretty minuscule market in the West, depending on what it is. But there's another thing to consider when it comes to Japan, and that's that, by and large, they're a fairly xenophobic society. It's one of their larger shortcomings that they are notorious for being extremely Japanocentric, in that they see everything going on in Japan and don't even really care about what's going on in the rest of the world as long as it doesn't affect them. And yet, there's these markets for video games out there, and not just video games, but also manga, anime, you name it, that's all over the place, and they just don't really jump on the chance like, say, a more global country like, say, the US or the UK or any number of European countries or something like that would go for. They just don't have that same mentality, and so they just don't jump on these opportunities. When we look at it and we're just baffled by it, it's just kind of a cultural thing, unfortunately. Now, this isn't really so much of a problem with Western games. Like you said, it is pretty much Japanese stuff. But they're not the only ones. I mean, there are plenty of, for example, Chinese games that never get released outside of China. I mean, to give you an example, I have two games that I outright know are Chinese games, and those are Prince of Qin and Dragon Throne Battle of Red Cliffs. And basically nobody knows they exist. In fact, nobody seems to know that China has a games market, and that's mostly because most of their games don't get released outside of China. They just don't secure the rights for it, they don't translate them, and all sorts of things like that. So it just never gets released outside of China. You see that with all sorts of places. It's just a shame, really. So I'd rather have staggered releases than nothing at all, let's put it that way. It is still annoying, though, I'll give you that. Next one is from Enjoy the Decline. Is YouTube your career now for life, or are you going to change careers later down the road? I don't know why people get the impression that YouTube is my job. It isn't. I don't do this full time. I've explicitly said that several times. It started out as a hobby, and it has just become something I have a passion for, so that's what I do with it. And with regards to any money that's made for the channel through, say, YouTube ad revenue and stuff like that, it all goes right back into the channel anyway. So, no, it's not my career right now. If for some bizarre reason I start making enough money for it to become my full-time job, then I would certainly do that. But as it stands, I'm just kind of stuck where I am. So, no, YouTube is not my career now for life, nor was it ever intended to be. It's always been just something I wanted to do on the side. Next one is from the Gaming Patriot. What do you think of the Steam machines? I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not really sure how it's going to actually turn out, because it's basically just a scaled down computer, but it's running Steam OS and everything like that, so you're going to have some limited options as far as games go. But it's certainly a neat idea, because the barrier to entry with PC has always been relatively high, mostly because you not only need to be able to get the computer itself, which is usually kind of expensive, and you need to be able to actually operate the computer, but you need to hook it up to all sorts of different peripherals, and a lot of people just don't have those. Most people have a TV, though, so buying a console is a matter of getting the console, plugging it in, and you're good to go. So this will at least eliminate some of that barrier to entry, but I don't really see it becoming a huge market dominator or anything like that. And the last question for today is from Freyaka. How do you recognize good or bad writing in video games? And this is where Assassin's Creed Liberation comes in. And that's because it's an example of mediocre and lazy writing. You see, there's nothing particularly interesting about Assassin's Creed Liberation as far as its plot goes, as far as its characters go, or anything like that. There's nothing that really sets these apart from really any other generic characters that you would run into. They do try to do some decent voice acting with these characters, but when you get down to the actual writing, it feels stilted and awkward, and it just doesn't work all that well. Now, one of the most obvious indicators of good or bad writing is in the dialogue. Does it flow well? Does it sound like real people talking? Because if it doesn't, then you might have an issue, unless that's exactly what you're going for. If you're talking with, say, aliens who don't think like humans, who don't act like humans, it wouldn't make sense for them to be talking like humans, unless they were trying to emulate human speech patterns and things like that. But when you get to more human characters who don't talk like humans really talk, it becomes really jarring and noticeable. Now, it's one thing if they're using more historical dialogue and it's a historical setting, then you can at least suspend your disbelief more. It makes more sense that way. If they are in the future and they're using a lot of weird slang that you've never heard of before, you can kind of put it in the back of your mind and be like, okay, whatever. But if there's no reason for them to be talking like aliens or just talking completely nonsensically, with a great example of that being the Metal Gear Solid series, where basically nobody talks like a real person, you either have to be going for something that's really weird and out there, and in the case of Metal Gear Solid, it ends up working because the whole thing is just completely ridiculous, so you can suspend disbelief entirely, or you have to make it actually fit. And that's where a lot of writers fail miserably. They write this dialogue, and to them it makes sense. To them it might sound really artistic and noble and things like that. And when it actually gets down to it, it doesn't sound like a human talking. Instead, it sounds like a robot or an alien or some really pretentious artist trying to shove something down your throat. That kind of stuff is where it really gets problematic. And when I bring it back to Assassin's Creed Liberation, the characters themselves don't really talk like aliens or robots, but they don't really have all that much going for them as far as their actual personality traits go. They're just kind of blank slates for the most part, and while they might have various slight quirks about them, it's not really enough to make the character feel alive. You need to look at this character, and when they're walking and talking and interacting with your character and everything like that, you need to look at that and go, do I believe this person could be a real person? If yes, then they have succeeded brilliantly at their writing. It is good writing. If no, then they've done something wrong. A good example of this is most of the characters in the Mass Effect games. While they may be weird aliens who talk funny, they're written with enough personality quirks and backstory and such like that that you can believe these would be real people if you were actually interacting with them, and what's best about that is it makes the characters so much stronger. So while the actual storyline in the Mass Effect games is not particularly great, the characters make up for that by being very believable, quirky, likable. They grow and change over time as things happen to them and they mature. That's the kind of thing that is the hallmark of great writing in a video game. BioWare does characters extremely well for the most part. Contrast that with world writing, where you look at the way that the world is designed, and you can ask questions like, okay, what did these people eat? And it answers it for you, whether it be through outright explanation or just showing you. Showing you is usually the better way of doing that. It's actually pretty easy to pick up on a lot of this stuff just from observing and not even really realizing it. To give you an example that was brought up in a video I saw a while back, which I unfortunately can't remember who put up the video, I'm sorry about that, but he brought up the point that Fallout New Vegas answers the question of what did they eat by showing you a series of farms outside of the New Vegas Strip. So it's like, well, how the hell would you support a population in this arid, radiated climate where you got this kind of burgeoning city called New Vegas? Oh, that's how. You got farms. Okay, that makes sense. Whereas when Fallout 3 tries to answer the question of what did they eat, the answer is just a vague shrug with a, I don't know. And it's things like that that you can just kind of pick up on subconsciously. So if you're going through a game and the world just doesn't feel right and you're not entirely sure why, you're probably picking up on something that the writers forgot to put in there, or they just didn't even think of putting it in there, that would actually make the world believable. And that's why you can find a lot of these really old games from the 70s, the 80s, that are strangely better at producing an atmosphere than newer games are, just because they occasionally did answer those questions that you might have about a world. What do they eat? How do they get from place to place? Why do they do things the way they do? Is there a culture in this area? What is that culture? What's their language? What's their day-to-day life like? All sorts of these questions that you probably wouldn't think to ask yourself just when you're playing a video game normally, but when you're thinking about things in a more critical stance, you're going to see them. And even if you're not thinking about these questions actively, your brain is still computing this stuff. And so if you've ever had that feeling that you were playing a video game and you were just wandering around this world and just it didn't feel right, it didn't feel real, then your brain has picked up on something that is wrong with the world design, and you're not necessarily seeing it right off the bat. But then we come to plot writing, and this is where things get dicey, because there's so many different kinds of plots out there that you can go with, and there's so many ways of doing those plots that it just becomes kind of a mess to try to keep track of things. But I like to just kind of boil it down to a few basic questions. Who, what, where, when, why, how? Who are the principal characters involved? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? When are they doing it? And where are they doing it? Most of these questions are pretty easy to answer, and if you can't answer them, there's probably something horribly wrong. When it comes to plots, usually the big question is why. Why are the characters doing what they're doing? And if you can't actually answer that with something that makes sense, there is something horribly wrong with your plot. And just as bad is when you answer that question with something that is really flimsy. Why are the bad guys in Wolfenstein doing what they're doing? Because they're Nazis. Okay, that makes sense, but it's still a really flimsy excuse. But the thing is, you don't really care about the plot in a Wolfenstein game. Not usually, anyway. Meanwhile, you go to something like Final Fantasy XIII, and really the question is not so much why is so-and-so doing so-and-so. It's more, why are any of the characters doing any of the things that they're doing at all? Nothing in that game makes any sense whatsoever. So that's admittedly a bit of an extreme example, but you get the idea, I assume. If you can't answer the questions that you're asking about a game, and they're not things that actually enhance the experience by you not necessarily knowing the full picture, then you should be worried about the state of the writing in the game. Now, there are instances where you can leave things open to interpretation, where you can leave things deliberately open for the sake of actually creating a mystery, and things like that, but those are tricky to do well. And it's just a matter of you knowing intrinsically when what they're trying to do just doesn't work. It's things like if they're building up to something that is this big mystery and then the reveal happens and it's just incredibly banal or just otherwise underwhelming, then they've failed. And here's the other thing that's problematic about game writing. The player is actually involved in the writing process, whether they know it or not. You see, writing for a video game is a lot different than writing for a movie. You have to keep in mind that the player is going to be doing things that you don't necessarily anticipate. The player is going to be just doing things out of order, they're going to be doing things in the complete opposite way of the way you designed it, and leaving things flexible is not something that most writers are willing to do. That's why you see so many of these video games rely so heavily on extremely linear scripted sequences, where they're just railroading you into their plot so they can be like, okay, well, we've got our plot now, so you just have to run along with it now. And while that sort of thing works okay for a movie where you're a passive observer, or you're reading a book or something like that, it doesn't work when you are an active participant in what's going on in the game. And that's why it feels so incredibly patronizing when the game just stops everything so it can basically go off into its own little plot land and leaves you sitting there going, okay, well, I guess I'm stuck with a cutscene again. And really, there's a lot more that goes into more intricacies with video game writing, but I don't really feel like I'm equipped to explain those, because I'm really not that much of an academic compared to a lot of people I know. So while I don't pick up on the extreme minutia that some people will nitpick to all hell, I do pick up on the bigger points, the things that will really make or break something, because you can go into minutia all day long and it can just get pretty ridiculous, frankly. But what's really going to make or break things are really the more basic questions that you have about something. And that's what I tend to focus more on. Although on occasion I do notice more of the minutia, and I think that's where people start to think I get kind of nitpicky, is when I actually do pick up on the minutia and I start talking about those in my reviews and such. But I try to focus a lot more on the big stuff that can be really problematic than the finer points. Anyway, that was Q&A 62. Sorry I got on a little bit of a ramble there, but that's how things go sometimes. Make sure to keep asking questions, and I will catch you guys in later videos.